Hello. Welcome to another episode of Ancient Office Hours by the Ozymandias Project. Trireme Transit is now boarding for all new and returning passengers. Now departing, present ponderings. Next stop is Ancient Office Hours at a library lost in the sands of time.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 89 of Ancient Office Hours. This week, I am joined by Dr. Dan Potts, a professor of Near Eastern Archaeology at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at NYU. He received his PhD in anthropology from Harvard, specializing in Near Eastern archaeology. His main areas of research are in Iran, Mesopotamia, and the Persian Gulf, and as a field archaeologist, he has conducted excavations in Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates. His books include Aspects of Kingship in Ancient Iran, Nomadism in Iran from Antiquity to the Modern Era, and Mesopotamia, Iran, and Arabia from the Seleucids to the Sasanians. He is also the editor of the 2-volume Blackwell Companion to the Archaeology of the Ancient Near East and the Oxford Handbook of Iranian Archaeology. In this episode, we discuss his path from anthropology into Near Eastern archaeology, a brief history of the Elamites, distinguishing Elamites from Assyrians, and about the difficulties for future research or excavations in Iran due to the current political situation. I hope you enjoy this episode, and if you like what you hear, please give us a 5-star rating and review us on Apple or Spotify.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan, for joining me this morning. And I want to start us off and just ask you, where did your love of ancient history, the ancient world, start?
Well, a love of history started in primary school. And then in middle school, I had a very good ancient history teacher, and we did various things. The bit that I remember the most was Plato's cave allegory. My teacher, Mr. Muir, clearly really enjoyed. And I think that was the first time that I thought in any way seriously about ancient Greece. And that I didn't really get much more in high school, although I studied Latin all through high school. So I got some Latin language, but I wouldn't say my teacher, I had the same teacher all 4 years. I don't think he was particularly knowledgeable about Rome or Roman society. But then when I was a freshman in college, I took a general sort of survey class on the world's great civilizations, and that's what really sort of got me going. So I was only 18, but I got really kind of interested in it at that point.
Did you know that there was such a thing as a classics major by the time you were a freshman, or did you sort of walk in, discover the class, and then discover that this was something that people actually could study?
Yes, I found out that there was such a thing. And it was a funny, not so funny, but a kind of salutary experience that in my high school, which was a very good public high school, but still it was a public high school. As I said, I had 4 years of Latin, all with the same teacher. By my senior year, the class was pretty small. And I was certainly one of the best in that class. My claim to fame was once translating 45 lines of the Aeneid in one period, so in about 50 minutes. Having said that, when I got to college, I enrolled in what I thought was going to be something very interesting and something I'd do well at, and that was a freshman seminar entitled Problems of Latin Translation. And that was also a small class, and I think I was probably the only person there who'd come from a public school. So there were kids there from Andover and Exeter and all kinds of top private schools in the Northeast who were like years ahead of me in Latin competence. Even though I'd had 4 years, it was not the same as their 4 years. And I quickly realized that, struggling with Catullus and Horace, that, especially poetry, which I really, apart from Ovid and the Aeneid, I don't think I'd done much poetry, but that this was like way over my head. On the other hand, the archaeology class I took was through the anthropology department, and it included a good dose of New World, especially Maya and Inca archaeology, but also Old World archaeology. And I also, because I was never hugely quantitative which is to say, I ducked out of math at the earliest possible opportunity in high school. And there was a biological anthropology class that would satisfy a natural science requirement, which I had to fulfill. And that class was really a kind of a mix between medical anthropology and sort of demography and population. And I liked it and I could do it because it wasn't quantitative. Exposure in those two classes in my freshman year made me think I'll major in anthropology. But I still did study classical archaeology as well and took a number of classes, which I enjoyed. But I got a very early opportunity after my sophomore year to go to Iran. And that's what really kind of got me onto the ancient Near Eastern path. I'd previously, after my freshman year, I'd gone on a project in the lower Mississippi Valley. And there was a big interest in North American archaeology and especially of the Southeast. And it was interesting. It was a wonderful experience, but I didn't think at the end of it, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. Whereas after I went to Iran, even though living conditions were tough and it was not a bed of roses, I still found the ancient Near East very exciting and thought this is what I'd like to do.
That's so cool. Trips to amazing foreign countries really do spark a love in sort of the best way that you can't anticipate. So I love that you were able to go to Iran and find like your passion. I mean, it's a wonderful feeling. It's very reminiscent of when I went to Greece for the first time and I landed and I said, wow, this is it. Like, this is amazing. I made the right choice and I don't want to study anything else. So.
Yeah. I mean, I often think how random it was. I mean, it was entirely random that I took that class, and it was entirely random that I then went to Iran. And it did spark that real love of a subject. Whereas, many people go through college, go through life without ever actually just accidentally bumping up against a subject that really, really grabs them. And I feel for them because this was entirely accidental. I had no plan. When I went to college, I thought, because as I said, I was not very quantitative, but I liked history and I also liked English. And so I thought, maybe I'll major in English. I don't know. So that was a complete, I veered off by about the third week of my first semester, even though we didn't have to declare a major that early, but it was entirely accidental.
Those are the best stories, in my opinion, because those are the ones that most closely mirror my own journey, because I did kind of exactly the same thing. I didn't know about classics. I went to a school that did not have a department of Near Eastern cultures, languages, or Near Eastern studies, nothing. So I went in and I was convinced that I was going to major in anthropology. And yeah, my first class of undergrad was a big classical mythology course. And I had a friend in there who just said, okay, well, if you like it so much, you have to go talk to the professor and figure out what do you do to study this. And so I ended up doing so. And they basically were very gracious and said, well, you should consider classics. And I said, okay, I will. And then my first advising appointment came like 2 weeks later. And then it was very clear that the anthro advisor I had was like, yeah, you're not interested in anthro at all. You don't want to be here. Go to classics. So
right.
Then I made the switch and I never looked back. So I love the serendipity of these things, and that's the wonderful thing about going to college as a young person. You just trip into a class and off you go. So, no, that's amazing. So once you did, you had this trip and you kind of knew, okay, now I'm into Persia. So was it hard to find classes or programs that would allow you to pursue this interest in the ancient Near East? Was it easy? I feel like classics departments are very Mm, they're very easily found in a lot of universities, but
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the first thing is that there was only in the anthropology department only the one professor who worked on the ancient Near East, because anthropology has people working, across the board and within archaeology. It can be anywhere in the world. There were some people who did kind of biblical archaeology, and I was strongly discouraged from getting into that, and it didn't interest me really either. But also, so I did all the Near Eastern archaeology I could, which was not a lot. The professor I worked with, he taught something every semester that, varied between being a little more theoretical and general or being more area specific. And I probably took everything that he offered, as well as quite a bit of other, European and Mayan and, Inca sort of things. But then when it came to graduate school, it sort of dawned on me that actually my experience had been very, very narrow. The site that I'd gone to is in southeastern Iran, a site called Tepe Yahya, and it was a big thing in the Bronze Age. It was also occupied later, but the professor I was working with was pretty uninterested in anything post Bronze Age. And he had come from Penn, which also had a very long standing project in Iran, but which was focused on the Iron Age. And in that stage of ignorance, I mean, I had a lot of respect for the professor at Penn, but it was in the far opposite kind of corner of Iran, the Northwest. I'd been down in the Southeast. I didn't know anything about it because that had never been offered. That subject matter had never been taught. There'd never been a survey on ancient Iran. So I knew a lot about the Southeast in the Bronze Age and basically nothing else. I did apply, in fact, to Penn, but I didn't want to go there, and I wasn't accepted. And I think I wasn't accepted because they knew I probably wouldn't go there. And actually, they were right. But I think I only applied to 2 places. There were other people working in Iran at Michigan, but doing at that time in the early 70s, a real new archaeology, much more processual, much more quantitative. And that also didn't really appeal to me. I ended up going to Germany for a year on a fellowship to study in Berlin, which was excellent. But then I ended up coming back to the professor I'd worked with, which was at Harvard, Karl Lambert Karlowski. So, that's not the kind of thing that most people would encourage their students to do. They would normally encourage them to go someplace else than where they did their undergraduate work. In this case, it was just that there were so few places where I could do something that kind of was in the same line of the past without, let's say, going to Oxford and so I ended up just coming back to Harvard. And that also kept me for a very long time quite narrow and quite focused on the Bronze Age of Eastern Iran.
I know that you study the Elamites, and this is something I have not had the pleasure of speaking about on my podcast. So for everyone who will be learning about this, can you just tell us really quickly, who were they and why did they attract you so much enough to study them?
On this excavation in Eastern Iran were discovered some early kind of proto-cuneiform tablets that were written in a language, or in a script, not a language, in a script that at that time was called Proto-Elamite, because examples of that sort of writing, which dates to around 3000 BC, had first been discovered at a site in southwestern Iran called Susa. And Susa was, for many, many centuries in its history, the capital of Elam. So Elam is really a geographical term that refers to the southwestern part of Iran that is today largely the province of Khuzestan, where Ahwaz is. So close to the Iraqi border, close to Mesopotamia, but in Iranian territory. And at a certain point in the late third millennium and early second millennium, the power that existed in Elam or around Susa was joined with the power that existed in the highlands just to the east, around near modern Shiraz in Fars province, the ancient name of which was Anshan. So Elam and Anshan are often appear in the same breath because also the kings at a certain point use the title King of Anshan and Elam or King of Elam and Anshan. Anyway, I, knew really very little about Elam, largely because while we bandied about this term Proto-Elamite all the time, we were dealing with material that really predated historical Elam, as it's known from the end of the third millennium and then right down to the time of the Persian Empire. And I thought, this is something, I ought to know more about since I'm using the term Proto-Elamite, and B, there are some things written, but they're almost all in French and German. There was a big book on the art of Elam that was really the sort of some of the treasures that the French expedition had excavated at Susa, beginning in the late 19th century and going right up until the time of the Iranian Revolution. And then there was also a kind of historical book on Elam that had been written by a German scholar. It was in German, it was translated into English, so at least there was that English version. But it was a popular book, even though it's not exactly a light read. But it had no critical apparatus. It didn't have footnotes. And so it's quite hard to use. And then because of the publication of inscriptions from Susa and the eventual recognition that there was a language that was not Semitic, it was not Akkadian, it was not Indo-European, so it was unrelated to Old Persian or modern Persian. It was something else, but written in cuneiform, and that is what got called Elamite. So I just, for all these reasons, I thought the world needs a book in English. And there'd been a whole lot more research done since the time of either the art historical book by a French scholar named Pierre Amier or the synthetic general historical book by Walter Hintz. And so I set about doing it. But one of the things that once I got my PhD and started working, unlike my professor who taught me, I do feel kind of obliged to give students a good overview of a subject if that's what I profess to be teaching. And I don't think it's, justifiable to just teach your very, very narrow preference all the time. And there was a lot of material to consider. And the more I got into it, the more I realized that I can't just sort of cut this off even at the coming of the Persian Empire, because the Elamites continue to be a presence and they continue to be referred to. Or I can't cut it off at the end of the sort of heyday of the Elamites in the second millennium, even though the Assyrians come in, they start bashing them and eventually kind of conquer them and take over the area. And then I thought, I can't really stop with Alexander because, again, the Elamites are present in literary sources and not to mention the archaeological material is there. And so I ended up taking it from prehistory all the way up to the Islamic conquest. And I remember one reviewer of that book, which was published by Cambridge. And so this reviewer, was giving them their opinion. And the reviewer said nice things about it, but then said, but I had to drag myself through those last chapters. Oh my God, from the time of the Cyrus the Great or the Persian conquest to the Islamic conquest, this was hard for me. And my reaction, which I wrote back to the publisher who sent me these reviews to respond to, was, well, that's the reviewer's problem. That's not my problem. I don't think there's anything wrong with trying to provide a long narrative history of a region or a people. And not everybody's interested in every part of that, but I felt it was an important thing to do, also because this is a book that's going to be used in teaching. So I did it. I've done that sort of thing many times, where I got interested in a subject, maybe that subject in an earlier period, but I would want to know how we got there. So I'd go back in time, and then I'd want to know what happened afterwards. How did that play out through time? That's sort of what got me going. And the Elamites, just, very briefly on their significance. So they were the immediate eastern neighbors of the Sumerians, then later the Babylonians. They caused a lot of trouble by supporting the Babylonians against the Assyrians when Assyria took over Babylonia, and that incurred the wrath of several Assyrian kings who then campaigned against them. They're interesting in their own right, but they're also a major thorn in the side of just about every power that existed in Mesopotamia proper. And at one point in the late 14th, 13th, and early 12th centuries, there were about half a dozen Elamite kings who were married to Babylonian, actually Kassite princesses. So the Kassites were a people who had come in after the Babylonian, the fall of the old Babylonian Empire. They had come in, and eventually they became the major power in Mesopotamia. And because one of these kings, several of them, but one of them whose mother was Kassite and father was Elamite, this guy said at a certain point, after the Assyrians had conquered Babylonia and put a puppet on the throne in Babylonia, this guy wrote a letter, and which is, we only know, it's a sort of literary piece. It's not an actual proper letter. But in it, he says, why am I the son of the daughter of the great Kurigalzu? So his grandfather was one of the greatest Kassite kings. And he said, why am I not on the throne? Why is this, this minion of the Assyrians on the throne, right? There's a lot of interesting interaction. And in the time of Hammurabi, for example, the Elamites were extremely powerful. So there's all of those reasons why it's very interesting. But having said that, it's also important to underscore the fact that, as I mentioned before, that Elamite, the language, is totally unrelated to Old Persian. And the Elamites have often been seen, both in the West and in Iran itself, in the historical literature, as being kind of aboriginal population of southwestern Iran prior to the arrival of Persian speakers or Old Persian speakers. And therefore, modern Persians often have little interest in the Elamites. They sort of begin their own story with Cyrus the Great and the Persian Empire, of which they're very proud. But the Elamites, for them, are this kind of slightly odd, prehistoric, early historic people that inhabited the region when the Persians arrived, the Persians not being indigenous to the Iranian plateau. So there's a whole sort of political and social aspect to the study of Elam, a modern aspect, which is also very interesting.
It's fascinating. And I remember thinking this before, but since they were there before, but since they also are kind of disowned, let's say, by some people, would you say there's a pretty decent comparison then between the Elamites being maybe what the Minoans were to the Greeks, sort of like the before peoples who kind of were somewhere away?
Yes, I think, exactly. I think that's right. Yeah. And, that sort of attitude, it's not uncommon. It's not universal. I mean, some people may be very proud of the prehistory of the place where they live, right? Even while knowing that really they're probably not descendants of those people, but they lived in the same environment. They built things, they created interesting things. But there are some cases where I can think of Arabs in Eastern Arabia, Southeastern Arabia, like the United Arab Emirates, who, even when they're shown some really fantastic archaeological material from the Bronze Age, they kind of look at it, they're amazed, they're bemused that it's there, and they would say, yeah, but that's not us, right? We know from Arabic history and folklore that Arabic speakers only came into this area probably in the early centuries AD. And so all of this Bronze Age or earlier stuff, yeah, the area was settled, but those are not my ancestors. It's interesting. On the other hand, somebody like Saddam Hussein in Iraq, for very obvious political reasons, made a big deal of kind of claiming to be the inheritor of the grandeur of Hammurabi, even though he was an Arab. The Arabs there are also of, let's say, relatively recent arrival, and he's no more a Babylonian than I am, right? So it's interesting. Different people have different attitudes towards the remote past. Some people are just happy to celebrate it because it's in the same place where they live, and they think that's pretty amazing. And other people, if they don't feel that personal connection, they might have a kind of distanced appreciation, but not a sort of visceral one. Whereas, say, with modern Iranians, there's a very strong, appreciation for the Persians of the Persian Empire, for the Sasanians of the Sasanian Empire in late antiquity. But the Elamites are a little too foreign geographically, but they don't identify with them. And also, it's very interesting, if you go to, let's say, Lebanon or Syria, you will find loads and loads of place names that are ancient, that go back to the Bronze Age, right? And you will find that modern Arabic has loanwords from Aramaic and even loanwords from Akkadian that are even older. But Persian has almost no loanwords from Elamite. I mean, they're literally, from the literature that I've seen, I won't say you can count the words on one hand. I'll say it's more like you can count the words on one or two fingers. So that's kind of interesting too. I mean, there are lots of place names that are not etymologically Iranian, but they're not necessarily Elamite either. Because there were other peoples living in Western Iran, but certainly there are certainly demonstrably non-Persian place names. It's just that there are not a lot of scholars who are so interested in figuring out the ancient holdovers in modern toponyms in a place like Iran. But otherwise, in spoken Persian, there's practically nothing from Elamite. And Elamite also, like Sumerian, it has no known or no, generally accepted cognates. It's like a linguistic isolate. Now, more than 40, 50 years ago, there is a scholar named David McAlpin who worked on a hypothesis that, going way, way back in time, I mean, much beyond the historic period, that the proto-language that Elamite became may have been related to the Dravidian family of languages in South Asia, the northerlymost one of which is Brahwi, which is spoken in parts of eastern Iranian Baluchistan and Pakistani Baluchistan. And more recently, he's come back to that hypothesis and with more evidence. That would speak to a very ancient period, if that's correct, and that there was a linguistic family that did encompass this Eastern language that we only know now as Brahui and Elamite to the west. Otherwise, it's unrelated to Akkadian. It's not Semitic. It's not Indo-European, as I said. So it's not Sumerian. So it really is a kind of fossil from a very early period.
Well, it's interesting because, especially when we look at or study anything anywhere around the ancient Mediterranean, these are geographical regions, places, ancient, territories that it was very common that you'd see movement and flow of different peoples, and these areas had a lot of indigenous tribes that were eventually replaced, and we don't exactly know where people come from. We still don't know where the Mycenaeans really come from, but hey, they appeared one day, and they were the people who sort of set the sort of ethnic basis for modern Greeks, which I think a lot of people find surprising, because a lot of people know the name of the Minoans and go, oh, so you mean modern Greeks are not descended from them? And you go, yes. And they get very surprised. But I was thinking, same thing in the ancient Near East, well, Middle East, let's say. There's very few countries or places where I feel like you have such long continuity from like very ancient times and prehistory up to the modern era that people stayed put. Now, there are places, but...
And of course, there may be places, and again, in Iran, for example, you would need to do some DNA analysis. You'd need to have preserved DNA, let's say, from burials of a remote date, and then do some analysis of modern people. I'm sure that, all of the genetic makeup of those early peoples is not 100% gone. But, in the same way that in England some years ago, they found some person who was a descendant of Cheddar Man, right? Well, that's a kind of random thing. I'm sure there Roman DNA, in Britain, right? And I'm sure there's a lot of Gallic in France, and I'm sure there's all kinds of stuff in Iran, and why not also Elamite in southwestern Iran? But it's purely hypothetical. It would require a concerted effort to get a DNA program up and running to identify that. And it's also interesting, there's been a lot of linguistic change and substitution, and that's also not a kind of straightforward business. Again, Iran in later times, in the 11th century, big parts of it were overrun by Turks from Central Asia, who eventually, these are the Seljuk Turks, who eventually, some of them stayed put, some of them kept on going all the way to modern Turkey. And there were Mongols, right? And there were all kinds of people, and adoption of language that's not exactly coeval with population replacement. So these are really difficult problems to sort of figure out. But certainly people can learn languages and adopt languages quite quickly in a matter of generations. And they may have all kinds of political reasons or economic reasons or religious reasons for doing so. So just because at a certain point let's say in the 9th century BC, there are all these different peoples mentioned in Assyrian sources as living in the Western Iranian mountain area, the Zagros Mountains. And then a couple centuries later, it looks like they're all Persians. Well, partly there was probably intermarriage, but partly there was also language adoption of Persian, and it's very complicated. And we tend normally not to have sources that are explicit about this kind of thing. The best I think one can do in many cases is simply try to understand from modern anthropology how these things operate, how languages are, taken up by one group or another. And it's why it's very good to have one eye sort of on the anthropological literature, because at the end of the day, we're all talking about people, right? And you have to know how people act and behave And that's one way of knowing. It's not a question of finding one-to-one correlations, but it's just having in the back of your mind certain ideas about what has happened in the past in different parts of the globe that makes it helpful when you're trying to solve your own particular problems.
I mean, the Elamites have a very interesting history, and clearly through your book and your work, you've taken people on a journey showing, right, starting in prehistory and ending very, very much later than I think anyone would have anticipated. So, why do you think that people don't want more like Elamite studies? Is it just because, I mean, clearly you found a lot of evidence. I mean, is it just because it's sort of the unicorn and people are like, well, I don't want to do that since it's kind of like a one-off. I want to just do something else where there's more.
Within ancient Near Eastern studies, Mesopotamia is pretty big, Egypt is pretty big, Hittites and the sort of Levant. But Iran is just remains, even though there's a lot of material and a lot of excavations, but it remains, a sort of outlier that's a bit exotic and a subject that relatively few people compared to those other fields actually teach. And so, if students come to college knowing about Greece and Rome and Egypt, and they see a class offered on the Elamites, they're probably going to think, what is that? And honestly, there are not that many people with enough of an interest to teach about that. So yeah, it's an outlier for sure, an outlier within the sort of greater Mesopotamian field, and it's even an outlier within, I'd say, Iranian studies. I just think that's the way it is. But once again, just because something is rare or not, it's not even exotic, it just seems odd and different, is no reason not to study it, right? That I think it's all the more reason. And compared to other areas which have got huge communities of scholars working on them, it's interesting to work on the Elamites or many aspects of Iranian archaeology because numerically speaking, there are far fewer scholars who've done that. And therefore, one feels that there's ample room for making a contribution and coming up with new ideas and discoveries. And I mean, if you think about the enormous literature on red and black figure Greek pottery, or even the Mycenaeans, or anything to do with Egypt, there's a tiny fraction of that number of people working, or that many of that number of publications when it comes to the Elamites and much of Iran. So to me, that's an attraction, not something that turns me off.
Well, clearly, again, lots of material, but since people, I guess, in the academic world, for whatever reason, are sort of kept away, can media help in this case? Like, I feel like there's a very valuable argument to be made that, like, if someone made some cool, HBO adaptation about the Elamites, I feel like that could help spur interest, but I don't know how feasible that is.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure it could. On the one hand, it's probably not going to be done with Iranian collaboration at the present moment for political reasons. On the other hand, due to the French excavations and other excavations in Iran, where the excavators were allowed to have a share of the finds, and that applies to the excavations from Penn or from Harvard or from Chicago, it is possible to do some kind of, a series on the Elamites that did not absolutely depend on getting to Iran to film. And yeah, I think it's public education on this is a huge thing. I have a little experience, very, very little, with school syllabi. College is a bit different, but if what coming into college is Egypt, Greece, and Rome, maybe you've heard about Hammurabi, or and maybe you know a little bit about the Bible or the biblical tradition, but that at the end of the day, I think that has a huge bearing on the direction that students might follow. And also, I've heard it said by, several colleagues that after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, when for many years it became impossible to go to Iran as an archaeologist, some colleagues who were specialists in Iran simply stopped teaching it because there's a kind of feeling that the students wouldn't take it. They want to take a course on the Hittites because they may have a chance to go and excavate in Turkey, right? They want to take a course on Athens, or Attica because they're hoping they're going to get to Greece and excavate. And that's all true. That's absolutely true. It's just that I think you're only exacerbating the problem if you then just are mum about the history that is now in an area that's difficult to access. And I always remember I had a professor, very distinguished Chinese archaeologist, Casey Chang, who had been at Yale for many, many years. He originally was from Taiwan. And, he came to the United States, he did his PhD, he taught at Yale for decades, then he came to Harvard, and he always taught Chinese archaeology. But all throughout the sort of heyday of the communist era and the Cold War, of course, there was no way anybody was going to go to China. There was no collaboration possible, but it didn't mean for him that the subject wasn't eminently worthy of being taught. And I feel that same way about Iranian archaeology, but students sort of vote with their feet. I have no doubt that the numbers, for a lot of reasons, the numbers that are going to enter a introductory class in classical archaeology are going to always be, by a factor of God knows how many, far more than if one offers a class on Iran, or let alone on the Elamites specifically, or Egypt. I mean, when I was teaching for a long time at the University of Sydney in Australia, where student numbers were carefully examined, enrollments were carefully examined, and people used to say, oh, couldn't you offer a class on Egypt? I mean, that way we'd get 100 students, as opposed to your 15. Well, A, I don't know much about Egypt. And B, I don't like the idea of offering a subject simply because it's going to have a big enrollment. I don't think that's very good. But the bottom line is, I'm not an Egyptologist. Of course, that's popular, and it always has been popular, and it remains very popular. And likewise, classes that really relate to the Bible are also popular. And biblical archaeology is sort of having, I think, kind of a renaissance. Good for them, that's fine. But I don't happen to work on that, right? And I'm too old to change now. So it's.
I think, yes, it's valid, but also as a more recent student who graduated undergrad in 2018, I can say, though, that I noticed a trend in that, you show us, or there is something that is in cultural memory that we've seen that we do enjoy. I could probably talk to a lot of people in my department who know their interests were not going to be in Persia. Now, that wasn't even an option to study at our school, but they would have still said, no, that's not really our thing. But having talked to a lot of people and said things like, well, we like Greece, we're studying it. Have you seen 300? What do you think about the Persians?
Yeah.
Blah, blah, blah. There were a lot of people who were like, yeah, I mean, they didn't like the way the Persians were portrayed in that, although that's like the biggest media thing that we've got showing the Persians. So there was a lot of interest in people saying, actually, if there were a class here, I would take it because I'm pretty sure 300 was terrible.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, I guess from the perspective of someone who specializes in Persia, I mean, is 300, like, as bad as it was, is it a good thing to use for pedagogy just to get interest? Because there are people who will look at that and say, I want the real thing.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, in one respect, anything that sparks an interest has some value. It's just that particular piece of work has so many negative, stereotypes and points about it that I would hesitate to use that But otherwise, if one wanted to choose a film to spark people's interests, there are not a whole lot of films. I mean, I might be wrong, but I don't think there are a whole lot of films on the Persian Wars or on Herodotus, right? I mean, but of course, there's some classicists and classical archaeologists do introduce Persian content. Meg Miller, who was my colleague for a while, talking about the depiction of Persians in Greek vase painting, or it could be, there's a huge interest still ongoing forever and ever in Herodotus. You'd think everything had been said about Herodotus, but apparently not. So, that is clearly a way to pique people's interest, and who might say, well, Herodotus said this and that and the other. Are there any Persian sources, or what does the archaeology show us? And there are ways in which that could be handled so that you would be using the sort of the lure through the Greek sources, through Herodotus, to actually as a kind of subterfuge to get students to look at the Persian side of things. And then, if they say, well, give us more, then that's easily done. But I think it's been, in a way, having said I'm not very quantitative, it's absolutely the case, I think, that if you bother to look through, 19th century literature, earlier 20th century literature, and you stacked up the publications about, let's say, Herodotus and the Greeks, or the Persian Wars from the Greek side versus what we have from the Persian side, there'd be this massive difference. And I don't think that's going to change particularly. But, I think through various publications and conferences and so forth, there is a healthy recognition on the, let's say, the Greek side, the classical side, of the importance of Iran, which is much healthier than it was even 30 years, 40 years ago. And I think that's not going to go away. I think that's going to improve. And the more a lot of, younger scholars, thoughtful scholars have now got serious curiosity about the Persian side of the equation, to the extent that some are, learning how to read not just Old Persian, but even Elamite from Persepolis, the so-called fortification texts that are contemporary with Darius, and that show us, they don't have reports on the Persian Wars. They show us what was going on there in one of the capitals of the Persian Empire, giving us insights that Herodotus simply doesn't. So I think that's pretty clear now. That's well recognized, and that's all to the good.
Good. Well, there's so much more that I want to get into that I don't have time for, unfortunately. But what I can say, though, is that for the stuff we didn't get to now, we did get to in a different podcast. And so for all the listeners who might be interested in, let's say, hearing about your book, I'll call it the new one that's coming out. Although by the time this episode comes out, I believe the book will already be long out, so it won't be so new by then. For anyone who wants to know about the right now new book that is forthcoming, I would encourage everyone to go listen to the episode that I recorded with you for the Portavood Center. So that show is Legacies of Ancient Persia, and we get a lot more about the Elamites and your book, and I don't even remember exactly what we covered in that one, but a lot of other great things. So I would recommend that as a companion to this episode. So for us here, though, I have a couple of questions that sort of end the interview portion. And the first is, when you were a student, either in undergrad or grad school, did you attend your professor's office hours?
Not exactly. I saw him regularly because I worked for him. I had a sort of work-study job, so I saw him literally daily.
Good enough. So as a professor yourself, though, if you had to give students a 30-second to a minute-long pitch on why students should go to office hours, what would you say?
Well, yeah, I think no matter how interesting a lecture might be, or a seminar, even with a dozen people. You're still not one-on-one, and there are still questions that come up and insights into the subject or why somebody else studied it that simply there's no room for them in the classroom. And also, of course, if anybody is interested in pursuing an academic career, it's extremely helpful to get a lot of opinions and insights from people who've gone that route, to see if it's really the right thing for you. If you've got, the interest sufficiently, the dedication, if it's something that you think you might want to do, there's nothing better than talking to somebody who does that to see if that's going to be a good fit for you.
Great. And you can pull from when you were a student, you can pull from as a professor. But I'm just curious, do you have a favorite memory or conversation or just anything that stood out to you during an office hour chat, whether it's official or unofficial?
Oh, it wasn't exactly an office hour. It was sort of after hours. I was invited to come along and meet a bunch of archaeologists. And one of my professors, my classical archaeology professor, was there with his wife. And my surname is Potts, right? And I met her, I shook her hand. She said, "Oh, Potts, that's an auspicious name for an archaeologist." And I remember looking at her blankly, not at all. What's Potts? Oh, okay, pottery, right. But it took a long time before the penny dropped and I actually twigged to what she was referring to.
I love that. That's amazing. And yes, actually, now that I think of it, that is kind of an auspicious name, especially for an archaeologist. So how fitting.
Yeah.
So at the end of each podcast episode, I ask if every guest will read Shelley's Ozymandias poem. And after you've read it, I'm just curious to know, and this does not have to be, right, the most erudite, wonderful, long explanation. This is meant to be a cold reading, but this poem has been cited in popular culture and just both by word of mouth as being something of elegance and great renown, and people sort of talk about this poem as being important and sticking with them and evokes a certain sense of, I don't know, it evokes something different for everyone, but a lot of people basically cite this poem as being quite, I don't know, just important and interesting. And I'm just curious to know if you agree with kind of this sentiment.
Okay, you want me to answer that or read it first?
Read it first,
okay.
And then you can answer that. So whenever you're ready.
Okay, here we go. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty in despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." Well, I think it's a great poem. And I've been reading an account by a French ambassador, Count de Cersei, who was sent to Iran in 1839. I'm not saying he knew Shelley's poem, he may have, but he certainly knew lots of works that referred to the sort of glories of Persia's past. And when he got there, he was massively disappointed. He saw ruins and he saw even much more recent buildings from the time of Shah Abbas the Great from the 16th century, one of the really famous kings of the early modern era, palaces, beautiful mosques, caravanserais, and for the most part, everything was in ruins. Now that had to do with the fact that the dynasty that Shah Abbas was part of had been conquered, and this was followed by almost a century, let's say 70, 80 years of civil war. So everything was trashed. And yet he knew, and from reading the works of much earlier European travelers, again from the 16th and 17th centuries, just how lavish and beautiful and elegant and ornate the palaces and buildings of some of these cities that he passed through had been. So he really, really kind of felt deeply the fact that human fortune can change so quickly, and you can go from having these wonderful, mighty, and colossal things to it being just down in the dust and a heap of ruins. And he felt deeply depressed by it. He couldn't wait to get out of there because he just found the atmosphere of decay and destruction so, so deeply depressing. Yeah. So thank you, Lexi. That was very apposite after spending much of the morning reading Count de Cersei's account of his embassy.
I mean, you hit the nail right on the head. I mean, I think that analysis is spot on. It really does. It gets to these big themes and evokes ideas of legacy and decay and what is monumentality. And so kind of in this wonderful vein that now you've set us up in, the last question I ask every single guest is, if you consider our modern society right now, do we have like a modern equivalent of us, an Ozymandias, something that we believe is amazing and great and wonderful, but realistically, will future humans agree? Will we look back at it sort of with melancholy? Will we say that's a terrible idea?
Well, I think somebody like Vladimir Putin is probably intensely proud of his palaces, and I doubt very much that they're going to have a long legacy, in the same way that Adolf Hitler was extremely proud of some of the architecture that was put up under the Third Reich, which literally within a matter of 5-10 years, it was lying utterly in ruins. But at his height, I'm sure when he drove around in his big car, he probably felt like this was, well, as he said, this was the 1,000-year Reich. This was going to be the dominant force on the planet for hundreds of generations. And you see how quickly that came undone. So that's what it makes me think of.
Very true. Very, very valid in both of those cases. And I'm sure there's a lot more as well in the more modern era. Many mini Ozymandiases, I'm sure. But I kind of lied. There is one more question that I'm going to ask you, and that is, where can people find you?
Well, I'm at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at NYU. The acronym is ISAW, ISAW. So if you just Google NYU ISAW, you'll get the website and you'll see something about me. Or on the academia platform, just put in my name in academia, and you'll see a whole lot of publications that I've put up there. So that's probably the best. Those are the two best ways.
Wonderful. Well, I'll make sure to attach those in the show notes as well, so people can find your faculty page wherever you may appear, and we will link your academia page so people can go and read your wonderful work. And I will also be putting in links so they can find your book once it is out as well, because I'm hopeful that people will want to read this new book on kinship, because I will definitely be getting a copy and reading it. So yeah, I want to thank you one more time for joining me on the podcast this morning. It's been such a pleasure to be able to speak with you again for a second episode. So
yeah, thank you, Lexi. It's always a pleasure.
Trireme Transit is now departing ancient office hours. Next stop is Present Ponderings.